Mom, thanks for covering every bill. We finally bought our own place, and we want privacy. Please pack your things. The November rain fell in sheets against the tall windows of the Grand Meridian Hotel, casting shadows that danced across the marble floors like ghosts of forgotten promises. Margaret Harris moved through the lobby with the practiced invisibility of someone who had spent 28 years cleaning the messes of people who never learned her name. Her uniform was pressed, though slightly worn at the elbows. Her hair, more silver than brown now, was pulled back into a tight bun that did nothing to hide the exhaustion etched into every line of her 52-year-old face. Her hands trembled slightly as she pushed the cleaning cart toward the executive suites on the 15th floor. The tremor wasn't new. It had started 3 months ago, around the same time the chest pains began. But doctors cost money, and money was something Margaret hadn't had in 28 years. Every dollar, every cent, every overtime shift had gone to one place, to Michael, her son, her entire world. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, revealing a hallway that smelled of expensive cologne and fresh lilies. Margaret took a deep breath, steadying herself against the cart. Just 3 more rooms tonight, then she could go home. Home to the cramped 2-bedroom apartment where she slept on a sofa that had broken springs, while Michael and his wife Rebecca occupied the master bedroom. Home to the place where she paid every bill, bought every grocery, covered every expense, while her son and daughter-in-law saved for their future. A future that she believed would one day include her. She didn't know how wrong she was. Margaret knocked softly on suite 1507, waiting for the customary silence that meant the guest was out. When no answer came, she slid her keycard through the lock and pushed the heavy door open. The suite was magnificent. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, furniture that cost more than she made in a year, and a silence so complete it felt almost sacred. She moved through the space with mechanical efficiency, emptying trash bins, replacing towels, straightening pillows that hardly looked disturbed. The guest in the suite was meticulous, she'd noticed, everything always in its place. No mess, no chaos, just an overwhelming sense of loneliness that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. As she reached for a coffee cup left on the mahogany desk, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She hesitated. Personal phones weren't supposed to be on during shifts, but something made her check. A text from Michael. "Mom, we need to talk tonight. Important. Be home by 8. Margaret's heart did a small, foolish flutter of hope. Maybe they wanted to tell her about a grandchild. Maybe Michael had finally gotten that promotion he'd been working toward. Maybe, just maybe, they wanted to thank her for everything she'd done. She slipped the phone back into her pocket, not noticing the coffee cup tilt in her other hand. Not noticing until the dark liquid splashed across the front of a tailored suit jacket that hung on the back of a chair. Margaret's blood turned to ice. The bathroom door opened. Alexander Sinclair emerged in a crisp white shirt, still buttoning his cuffs. He was 48 years old, though he carried himself with the weight of someone much older. His dark hair was touched with gray at the temples, and his blue eyes held a coldness that came from building a billion-dollar empire on the bones of his own humanity. He looked at Margaret, then at his ruined jacket, then back at Margaret. She couldn't breathe. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, the words tumbling out in a rush of panic. "I'm so sorry, sir. I didn't see you. I thought, I'll pay for the cleaning. I'll replace it. It's fine," Alexander said, his British accent cutting through her panic with surgical precision. "No, it's not fine. I should have been more careful. Margaret was already pulling paper towels from her cart, her hands shaking so badly she dropped them twice. Alexander watched her scramble to pick up the towels, watched the way her shoulders curved inward as if trying to make herself even smaller, watched the genuine terror in her eyes at having made a mistake. And something in his chest, something he thought had died long ago, tightened painfully. "Please," he said, softer this time, "stop. It's just a jacket." But Margaret couldn't stop. She was dabbing at the jacket with trembling hands, muttering apologies, fighting back tears that had nothing to do with coffee and everything to do with a lifetime of being afraid she wasn't good enough, wasn't careful enough, wasn't worthy enough. I work doubles all week, she was saying, more to herself than to him. I can pay for it, I promise. Just please don't tell my supervisor, please. I need this job. I need... Look at me. The command was gentle, but it stopped her mid-sentence. Margaret lifted her eyes, and for the first time in 28 years of cleaning hotel rooms, she actually looked at a guest. Really looked. Alexander Sinclair had the face of a man who understood loneliness. It was there in the set of his jaw, the shadows under his eyes, the way his mouth held the memory of smiles that never quite reached completion. "What's your name?" he asked. "Margaret. Margaret Harris." Margaret. He said it like he was testing the weight of it. "How long have you worked here?" 15 years at this hotel, but I've been cleaning for 28 years total. 28 years. The same amount of time since his mother had written him her last letter, the one he'd been too busy to read until after her funeral. "Do you have children?" The question came out before he could stop it. Margaret's face transformed. For just a moment the exhaustion lifted, replaced with a love so fierce it was almost painful to witness. "A son, Michael. He's 28. He just got married 2 years ago. They're doing so well. He works in finance, and his wife, Rebecca, she's in marketing. They're saving for a house, a real house, with a yard and everything." She said it with such pride, such pure, uncomplicated joy. Alexander felt something crack inside his chest. "That's good," he managed, "that they have you to help them." "Oh, I'd do anything for Michael," Margaret said, and the certainty in her voice was absolute. "He's my whole world. Everything I do is for him." There was something in the way she said it, a desperate kind of love, the kind that gave everything and asked for nothing, that made Alexander turn away. He'd heard that tone before, in his mother's voice, on the answering machine messages he'd been too busy to return, in the letters he'd filed away unread, in the final voicemail that said simply, "I understand you're busy, darling. I just wanted to hear your voice one more time."
He'd listened to that voicemail at her funeral, 17 hours too late. "Keep the jacket," he said abruptly. "Donate it. Throw it away. I don't care." "Sir, I couldn't possibly." "You can. You will." He pulled out his wallet and extracted several $100 bills, pressing them into her trembling hands. "For the inconvenience." Margaret stared at the money like it might bite her. "This is too much. This is way too much." "Then use it for your son, for his house." Alexander moved toward the door, needing to be away from this woman who reminded him too much of ghosts he couldn't bury. "I have a meeting." He left her standing there, holding money she would never spend on herself, in a room that cost more per night than she made in a week. As the door closed behind him, Alexander leaned against it, breathing harder than he should be. His hands were shaking. When was the last time his hands had shaken? Inside the room, Margaret carefully folded the bills and tucked them into her pocket. She wouldn't spend them. She would give them to Michael tonight when they had their important talk. Maybe it would help with the down payment on that house. Maybe it would make him smile at her the way he used to when he was little. Before Rebecca, before the distance that had grown between them like a slow-moving glacier. She finished cleaning the suite in silence, not knowing that Alexander Sinclair was still standing in the hallway outside, unable to make himself walk away from whatever it was he'd just witnessed. Not knowing that her life was about to shatter into pieces so small she wouldn't recognize herself in the fragments. The rain kept falling, the city kept moving, and Margaret Harris kept cleaning, kept hoping, kept loving with a heart that was about to learn the cruelest lesson of all. That sometimes love isn't enough. The rest of Margaret's shift passed in a blur of repetitive motions and racing thoughts. She couldn't stop thinking about Michael's text. Important. He'd said it was important. In the past 2 years, since he'd married Rebecca, important conversations had become rare. Most of their interactions were limited to Margaret asking if they needed anything, and Rebecca answering with a tight smile that never reached her eyes. But tonight felt different. Margaret could sense it the way mothers sense things, that inexplicable instinct that lives somewhere between the heart and the gut. She clocked out at 7:45, giving herself just enough time to catch the bus home. The Grand Meridian was in the heart of the city, where people like Alexander Sinclair stayed when they needed to feel above the world. Margaret's apartment was in a neighborhood where the streetlights flickered and the sounds of sirens were as common as birdsong. The bus was crowded, humid with the smell of wet clothing and tired bodies. Margaret stood holding a pole, her reflection ghost-like in the rain-streaked window. She looked old, she thought. When had she gotten so old? Michael was only 28, which meant she'd been 24 when she'd found him. 24 and devastated by infertility, mourning a future of children that would never come. And then, like a miracle wrapped in tragedy, there was Michael, 3 years old, orphaned by a car accident, with dark curls and eyes that held too much sorrow for such a small face. She'd known the moment she saw him, known with a certainty that transcended blood and biology and every conventional definition of motherhood. He was hers, she was his, and nothing else mattered. The adoption had taken 8 months, during which Margaret worked 3 jobs to prove she could provide. She'd been a waitress at breakfast, a secretary at lunch, and started her cleaning career in the evenings. By the time Michael came home with her, she had a small apartment, a second-hand crib, and enough love to rebuild a broken child's world. And she had rebuilt it, through every skinned knee, every school play, every teenage heartbreak, every triumph and failure. She'd been there, always there, never missing a moment. When had Michael started missing hers? The bus lurched to a stop 3 blocks from her apartment. Margaret hurried through the rain, her thin jacket soaked through in seconds. The apartment building was a 5-story walk-up that smelled of old cooking and older secrets. She climbed the stairs slowly, feeling every one of her 52 years in her knees. Outside apartment 3B, she paused, took a breath, smoothed her wet hair, tried on a smile that felt like broken glass. The door wasn't locked. It never was. They were a family, after all. Margaret pushed it open and stepped into the small living room that had been her whole world for the past 7 years. Michael was sitting on the sofa, her sofa, the one she'd bought 15 years ago and still slept on every night. He was 28, tall and lean like his biological father had been in the photos Margaret had saved for him. His dark hair was styled perfectly, his clothes expensive, his whole appearance that of a young man on his way up in the world. He wasn't looking at her. Rebecca was standing by the window, arms crossed, wearing an expression that Margaret had learned to read as carefully as a map through hostile territory. Rebecca was beautiful, in a sharp, calculated way. Blonde hair always perfect, makeup always flawless, clothes always just expensive enough to make a statement. She'd come from money, the kind that didn't need to be loud because everyone already knew it was there. She'd never understood why Michael's mother lived with them, had made that clear from the first day she'd walked into this apartment and looked around like she'd stepped in something unpleasant. "Hi, honey," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice light. "Sorry I'm a little late. The buses were—" "We need to talk, Mom." Margaret's heart began to beat faster. She set down her purse, peeled off her wet jacket. "Of course. Is everything okay? Are you both all right?" "We're fine," Rebecca said, and there was something almost victorious in her tone. Michael shot his wife a look that Margaret couldn't quite read. Then he turned back to his mother, and for just a second, Margaret saw something in his eyes, guilt, maybe, or shame, before it disappeared behind a mask of careful neutrality. "Mom, Rebecca and we've been saving, working really hard, and we finally did it. We bought a house."
Time seemed to slow. Margaret's face split into a genuine, radiant smile. "Michael! Oh my God, that's wonderful! That's so wonderful! Where? Can I see pictures? When do you move?" "Next week," Rebecca said. "It's in Meadowbrook, 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, finished basement. Everything we wanted." 4 Bedrooms, Margaret repeated, her mind already spinning with possibilities. That's perfect! One for you two, one for a nursery when you're ready, one for an office, and one for... Mom. Michael's voice was gentle, but there was steel underneath. We need to talk about living arrangements. The smile began to fade from Margaret's face like light bleeding from a sky at dusk. The house is a fresh start for us, Rebecca said, stepping forward. Her perfume was expensive, cloying. A chance to really begin our lives as a married couple, to have our own space, our own privacy. Of course, Margaret said quickly. I understand. You're starting a new chapter. That's so exciting. And this apartment, the lease is in my name, so I'll stay here and you can... Actually, we're planning to give up this apartment. The rent here, combined with the mortgage, it's too much. We need to consolidate expenses. Margaret's hands were beginning to shake again. I see. So you're thinking maybe I could find somewhere smaller? Something cheaper? I could do that. I could definitely do that. It might take me a few weeks to find something, but we're thinking sooner than that. The timing is actually perfect because we close on the house next Friday, and the lease here is up at the end of the month. End of the month? Margaret echoed. That's next Wednesday. 5 days, Rebecca confirmed as if Margaret couldn't count. The room was spinning now, just slightly. Margaret reached for the back of a chair to steady herself. 5 days. Okay. That's fast, but I can figure something out. Do you know of any places? Maybe something near you so I can still see you both and when the baby comes? Mom? Michael stood up. He was so tall. When had he gotten so tall? The house we bought, it's for me and Rebecca. Just us. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun that had just been fired. Just you? Margaret heard herself say as if from very far away. We're starting our own family, Rebecca said, and her voice had an edge of impatience now. We need privacy, space, time to be a couple without... She trailed off, but the unspoken word, you, echoed louder than anything she had actually said. But I'm not in your way, Margaret said, hating the pleading note in her voice. I work doubles most days. You barely see me. I clean, I cook when you want me to. I stay out of... It's not about being in the way, Michael said, but he still wouldn't meet her eyes. It's about us needing to establish our own household, make our own decisions, live our own lives. I want that for you, Margaret said desperately. I've always wanted that. Everything I've done, every sacrifice, it's been so you could have exactly this, a home, a future, a life. And we appreciate that, Rebecca said with a smile that could cut glass. We really do, which is why we're telling you now, giving you time to make arrangements. 5 days isn't time, Margaret said, her voice breaking. 5 days is nothing. Where am I supposed to go? How am I supposed to find a place in 5 days? You're resourceful, Rebecca said. You've always been good at figuring things out. Michael flinched at that, but he said nothing, did nothing, just stood there with his hands in his pockets, staring at a point somewhere past his mother's shoulder. Michael, Margaret whispered, honey, look at me, please. He did, finally, and what he saw in his face made her blood run cold. Guilt, yes, but also resignation, decision, the look of someone who'd already made his mind up and was just waiting for the conversation to be over. Mom, thanks for covering every bill, he said, and his voice was toneless now, like he was reading from a script. Thanks for everything you've done. We really are grateful. But we bought our own place now, and we want privacy. We need you to pack your things." The floor dropped out from under Margaret's world. She stood there in the apartment she had paid for, wearing a uniform still damp from rain and sweat and 28 years of labor, staring at the son she had raised from rubble, and felt the last piece of her heart crumble into dust. "You're kicking me out," she said, testing the words, seeing if they could possibly be real. "You're actually kicking me out." "We're not kicking you out," Rebecca said with exaggerated patience. "We're simply explaining that we're moving forward with our lives, and we'd like you to do the same, separately." "I paid for your college," Margaret heard herself say. "I worked 3 jobs so you could go to that school. I sold my house. I sold my mother's house so you wouldn't have student loans." "And I'm grateful for that," Michael said, but his tone suggested he was grateful the way one is grateful for rain, an obligation to acknowledge, not a debt to repay. "I've paid every bill in this apartment for 7 years. Every grocery, every utility, every single expense, while you and Rebecca saved for your future. I slept on a broken sofa so you could have the bedroom. I worked doubles so you could have savings. I gave you everything." "Nobody asked you to do that," Rebecca said quietly. The words hit like a physical blow. "Excuse me?" Margaret whispered. "Nobody asked you to martyr yourself," Rebecca said, warming to her theme now. "You made those choices. You decided to sell your house, to work yourself to exhaustion, to sleep on a sofa. Those were your decisions, not ours." "I did it because I love him," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face now. "Because he's my son." "He's your adopted son," Rebecca said, and the words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that would never quite smooth out. Michael went rigid. "Rebecca," he said. "What? It's true. She adopted you. It's not like you actually share blood. It's not like she's actually—" "Don't," Michael said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Actually what? Not actually his mother? Is that what you were going to say?" Rebecca said nothing, but her smile said everything.
Margaret turned to Michael. "Is that how you feel? That I'm not actually your mother because I didn't give birth to you?" Michael's jaw worked, his hands clenched and unclenched, and then, in a voice so quiet it could barely be heard, he said, "I don't know what I feel anymore." And that, Margaret realized, was the truth that had been hiding under all the others. He didn't know. Rebecca had spent 2 years whispering poison into his ear, pointing out every sacrifice as manipulation, reframing every act of love as control, until Michael couldn't tell the difference between devotion and debt. "I need you to leave," Margaret said suddenly. Rebecca blinked. "What?" "This apartment. The lease is in my name. I've paid every bill. So I need you both to leave. Now." "Mom," Michael started. "Now!" The word came out as a roar that shocked even Margaret. "Get out of my house!" For a moment, nobody moved. Then Rebecca grabbed her purse, shot Margaret a look of pure venom, and stormed toward the door. Michael hesitated, his hand reaching toward his mother, his mouth opening as if to say something. But no words came. He followed his wife out of the apartment, leaving Margaret standing alone in the small living room that had been her whole world. The door clicked shut, and Margaret Harris, who had survived the loss of her fertility, the adoption process, 28 years of back-breaking work, and every hardship that comes with choosing love over comfort, collapsed onto her broken sofa and sobbed until she couldn't breathe. Outside, the rain kept falling. Inside, something infinitely more precious shattered into pieces that might never fit back together again. And 3 blocks away, Michael sat in his car with his hands on the steering wheel, listening to Rebecca rant about his mother's dramatics, while somewhere deep inside him a small voice whispered that he'd just made the worst mistake of his life. But he didn't listen to that voice. Not yet. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She sat on the sofa as darkness turned to gray dawn, staring at nothing, seeing everything. The small bookshelf filled with Michael's childhood photos, the graduation picture she'd had professionally framed, the crayon drawing he'd made in first grade, a stick figure with yellow hair, holding hands with a smaller stick figure, the word Mom written in crooked letters above. She'd kept everything. Every report card, every award, every scrap of evidence that Michael had existed, had grown, had become the man she'd believed he would be. A man who now wanted her gone. Her phone buzzed at 6 in the morning, a text from Michael. "I'm sorry about last night. Rebecca was out of line. But Mom, we still need you to find other arrangements. Please understand, this isn't personal." Not personal? As if there was anything more personal than a child abandoning the parent who'd given them everything? Margaret's hands shook as she typed back, "When did I become a burden to you?" The response came quickly. "You're not a burden. We just need space. I'm 28, Mom. I need to build my own life." "I never stopped you from building your life. I built it for you." There was a long pause. Then, "Maybe that's the problem." Margaret stared at those 5 words until they blurred. Maybe that's the problem. She loved too much, given too much, sacrificed too much, and somehow that had become the problem. She didn't respond. What was there to say? At 7, she called in sick to work. The first time in 15 years. Then she sat at the small kitchen table and did something she hadn't done in 28 years. She opened her own bank account and looked at the balance. $432. 28 years of work, and she had $432 to her name. Everything else had gone to Michael, to his childhood, his education, his wedding, his life. Margaret put her head in her hands and tried to remember when she'd last done something just for herself. Tried to remember who she'd been before she became nothing but Michael's mom. Tried to remember if there had ever been a Margaret Harris who had dreams beyond her child's smile. She came up empty. At 9 o'clock there was a knock on the door. Margaret wiped her eyes, smoothed her hair, and opened it. A delivery man stood there with a small white envelope. "Margaret Harris?" "Yes." "Sign here, please." She signed, took the envelope, and closed the door. Inside was a handwritten note on thick, expensive paper. "Miss Harris, I witnessed your conversation last night. I apologize for the intrusion. My room is directly below yours, and sound carries in these old buildings. I'd like to speak with you if you're willing. I have a proposition that might interest you. Please meet me at the Garden Terrace Cafe at noon if you can. Alexander Sinclair, Suite 1507. Margaret read the note 3 times. Alexander Sinclair, the man whose jacket she'd ruined, the man who'd looked at her with something that almost resembled understanding. He'd heard everything. Shame flooded through her, hot and poisonous. A stranger had witnessed the most humiliating moment of her life, had heard her own son dismiss her sacrifices, had heard her own voice break as she begged not to be thrown away. She should throw the note away, should forget it ever existed, should find whatever dignity she had left and cling to it with both hands. But it was 9 o'clock in the morning, and she had nowhere to go, no one to call, and $432 to somehow build a life on. And Alexander Sinclair had said he had a proposition. At 11:30, Margaret showered for the first time in 24 hours. Put on the one dress she owned that wasn't a uniform, applied minimal makeup to hide the worst of the crying damage. Looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. When had she become invisible? The Garden Terrace Cafe was the kind of place Margaret had walked past 1,000 times but never imagined entering. Tall windows, white tablecloths, waiters in actual suits.
The kind of place where a single meal cost what she spent on groceries in a week. She stood outside for 5 full minutes before gathering the courage to walk in. Alexander Sinclair was already there, seated at a table near the window. He stood when he saw her, actually stood, like she was someone worth standing for, and gestured to the seat across from him. "Miss Harris, thank you for coming." Margaret sat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Mr. Sinclair, about last night, I'm so sorry you had to hear." "Don't." His voice was firm, but not unkind. "Don't apologize for being hurt by people who should have protected you." Margaret's throat tightened. She looked down at the table, fighting tears she'd promised herself she wouldn't cry in front of a stranger. "I heard everything," Alexander continued quietly. "I heard your son dismiss your sacrifices. I heard his wife diminish your relationship. I heard you beg for the basic dignity of being seen."
Then you know what a pathetic, I know what a remarkable woman sounds like when she realizes she's been taken for granted by people who don't deserve her, Alexander interrupted. I know because I was one of those people once. Margaret looked up, startled. Alexander's face was carefully neutral, but his eyes held a pain that mirrored her own. My mother raised me alone after my father died. Worked 3 jobs so I could go to university. Sacrificed everything so I could build my company. And I thanked her by being too busy to visit, too important to call, too focused on money to notice she was dying. He paused, his jaw tight. I got the call on a Tuesday. She'd had a massive stroke. By the time I got to the hospital, she was gone. No goodbyes, no last words, just a voicemail on my phone that said she understood I was busy and just wanted to hear my voice one more time. Margaret felt tears spill down her cheeks. I'm not telling you this for sympathy, Alexander said. I'm telling you this because I see in you what I saw in my mother too late. A person who loved so completely that she forgot to save anything for herself. And I'm telling you that your son is making the same mistake I made. I don't think Michael is going to change his mind, Margaret whispered. Maybe not today, maybe not even next month, but he will change it. And when he does, I don't want you to be destroyed by the weight. Alexander reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He slid it across the table. What is this? Margaret asked. A job offer. I have a house in Connecticut. Large. Too large for one person, really. I need someone to manage it. Not as a maid, but as a head of household. Someone to oversee the staff, manage the property, make it feel less like a mausoleum. Margaret stared at the paper without touching it. Mr. Sinclair, I appreciate the gesture, but I'm not a charity case. You're not charity. You're someone with 28 years of experience working harder than anyone I've ever met. Someone who knows how to manage a household on nothing and make it work. Someone who deserves a chance to live in a place that appreciates what she brings instead of what she gives up. I don't understand, Margaret said slowly. Why would you do this? You don't know me. Alexander was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was rough with old pain. Because my mother died believing she wasn't enough, believing all her sacrifices were meaningless. And I can't bring her back or undo my mistakes. But I can make sure another mother doesn't end up broken by a child who was too blind to see her worth. Margaret picked up the paper with trembling hands. The salary listed was more than she made in 6 months of double shifts. This can't be real. It's real. The position starts immediately. Housing is included. A private cottage on the property. Health care is included. Everything is included. But the apartment, my lease. I'll cover the lease until it expires. Your son can have his fresh start without guilt, and you can have yours without sacrifice. Margaret looked at this man, this stranger who seemed to understand her in ways her own son didn't. Why? She whispered. Really, why? Alexander met her gaze, and in his eyes, Margaret saw something she recognized. Regret so deep that it had carved canyons into his soul. Because I couldn't save my mother, he said simply, but maybe I can save you. The word save hung in the air between them. heavy with meaning neither of them was quite ready to examine. Margaret folded the paper carefully and put it in her purse. "Can I think about it?" "Of course, but Miss Harris," Alexander's expression softened, "you have 5 days before your son expects you gone. Don't spend them hoping he'll change his mind. Spend them building something for yourself." Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She left the cafe in a daze, Alexander's words echoing in her mind. Don't spend them hoping he'll change his mind. But how do you stop hoping for the people you loved? How do you turn off 28 years of devotion like a faucet? She didn't know. But as she walked back to the apartment that would soon no longer be hers, Margaret made a decision. She pulled out her phone and typed a text to Michael. "I'll be out by Friday. Good luck with the house. I hope it brings you everything you're looking for." Then, before she could second-guess herself, she pulled Alexander's job offer from her purse and dialed the number at the bottom. He answered on the first ring. "Ms. Harris?" "I accept," Margaret said. "The position. I accept." There was a pause. Then, "I'll have a car pick you up Friday morning, 9 a.m. "Thank you, Mr. Sinclair." "Alexander." "And, Ms. Harris, you're making the right choice." Margaret ended the call and stood in the middle of the sidewalk, surrounded by people rushing to lives she would never understand, and felt something she hadn't felt in 28 years. Not happiness, exactly, not yet. But maybe, just maybe, the first fragile seed of hope. The next 4 days passed in a blur of boxes and brutal honesty. Margaret had accumulated surprisingly little in 52 years of life. Most of the furniture in the apartment belonged to Michael and Rebecca. Most of the decorations were things she had bought for them, not for herself. When she packed up her own belongings, everything fit in 6 boxes. 6 boxes for a lifetime. She packed Michael's childhood things separately, the photos, the awards, the drawings, the report cards, put them in a box labeled Michael's Memories and left it in his closet. If he wanted them, he could take them. If not, well, they would sit there like ghosts of the boy he'd been before he learned to calculate love in terms of obligations and inconveniences. Michael didn't visit. He texted twice, once to ask if she needed help moving, once to confirm she'd be gone by Friday. Both messages were brief, impersonal, the kind you'd send to a roommate you barely knew. Margaret responded to both with single-word answers. No. Yes. Rebecca sent a single message Thursday night. "Please leave the keys on the counter. We're changing the locks anyway, but it's a courtesy thing." Courtesy, as if courtesy had ever been part of Rebecca's vocabulary when it came to Margaret. On Thursday afternoon, Margaret walked through the apartment one last time. She had cleaned it, of course, scrubbed every surface, washed every dish, vacuumed every corner, left it better than she had found it 7 years ago. Because that's what Margaret Harris did. She left places better, even when those places had broken her.
She found herself standing in the doorway of Michael's childhood bedroom, the room that was now an office, the walls repainted, the memories erased as efficiently as if they'd never existed. There was a photo on the desk, though. Michael and Rebecca on their wedding day, both of them smiling, perfect, beautiful. Margaret picked up the photo, traced Michael's face with one finger. "I hope you find what you're looking for," she whispered to the image. "I hope it makes you happy, and I hope one day you understand what you threw away." She set the photo back down and walked out of the room. At 8 p.m., she sent one final text to Michael. "Everything's clean. Keys are on the counter. Take care of yourself, honey. I'll always love you." She didn't add, "Love, Mom." Somehow, it felt presumptuous now. Michael's response came at 9:30. "Thanks." "You too." 2 words. "You too." Margaret turned off her phone and went to bed on the broken sofa for the last time. She didn't cry. There were no tears left. Friday morning arrived cold and crystalline, the kind of November day that makes everything look sharp-edged and unforgiving. Margaret was standing outside her apartment building at 8:59 when a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. A driver in a neat uniform got out and approached her. "Miss Harris?" "Yes." "I'm Daniel.
Mr. Sinclair sent me. He started loading her boxes into the trunk with the kind of efficiency that spoke of years of practice. Is this everything? This is everything, Margaret confirmed, hearing the echo of her own words. Everything. 6 boxes was everything. The drive to Connecticut took 2 hours. Margaret watched the city give way to suburbs, then to genuine countryside. Trees wore the last stubborn leaves of fall like battle medals. The sky was impossibly blue. It occurred to Margaret that she couldn't remember the last time she'd left the city, couldn't remember the last time she'd been in a car that didn't smell like exhaust and other people's problems. "Have you worked for Mr. Sinclair long?" she asked Daniel. 10 years, he said. "He's a good employer. Fair. Doesn't ask what he wouldn't do himself." "Is he happy?" Daniel glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "I don't think Mr. Sinclair knows what happy looks like, ma'am, but he's decent. That's rarer than happiness, in my experience." They turned off the highway onto a private road that wound through forests that looked like something from a storybook. Eventually, an iron gate appeared, opened automatically, and they passed through into grounds that took Margaret's breath away. The house was enormous. Not just large, but genuinely magnificent. 3 stories of weathered stone and tall windows, surrounded by gardens that even in November looked like paintings. To the left, Margaret could see a smaller building that Daniel gestured toward. "That's your cottage. 2 bedrooms, full kitchen, garden view. Mr. Sinclair had it furnished, but if you want to change anything, just let him know." My cottage, Margaret thought. When was the last time she had her own space? The car stopped in front of the main house, and Alexander emerged from the front door. He was dressed more casually than in the hotel, dark jeans, a sweater, but he carried the same weight of controlled grief. "Miss Harris, welcome." Margaret got out of the car, suddenly aware of how out of place she was in this setting. "Mr. Sinclair, Alexander, I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me yet. You haven't seen what a disaster this place is." He gestured to the house with something that might be humor in a different person. 23 rooms, and I use exactly 2 of them. It's absurd." He showed her through the house, and Margaret understood what he meant. It was beautiful, ornate, expensive, perfect, but utterly lifeless. Every room looked like a museum exhibit. No personal photos, no books left lying open, no coffee cups left on tables. Nothing that suggested a human being actually lived here. He led her through a side door and across a garden path to the cottage. It was smaller than the main house, but still larger than Margaret's entire apartment had been. The interior was simple but elegant. Hardwood floors, comfortable furniture, windows that looked out over gardens and forest. "There's a bedroom upstairs and one down here," Alexander said. "The kitchen is fully stocked. Internet, cable, whatever you need. The staff knows you're head of household now. They report to you about scheduling and property issues." Margaret walked through the space slowly, touching things gently as if afraid they might disappear. A real kitchen, a bedroom with a real bed, windows that didn't look out at other people's walls. "I don't understand how this is my life now," she said softly. Alexander leaned against the doorframe. "Because someone finally gave you what you deserved, instead of what you could endure." Their eyes met, and something passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or understanding. 2 people who'd been destroyed by the people they loved most, finding an unexpected refuge in each other's brokenness. "I'll let you settle in. If you need anything, I'm in the main house. Otherwise, take the weekend. We'll discuss details Monday." He left before Margaret could respond. She stood alone in her cottage, and let herself cry. But this time, the tears weren't only grief. They were also relief and exhaustion, and the strange, tentative feeling of someone who'd been drowning finally breaking the surface of the water. Outside, Alexander walked back to the main house, his hands in his pockets, his mind 1,000 miles away. Or rather, 8 years away. To a hospital room that he'd arrived 17 hours too late to say goodbye to the woman who had given him everything. He couldn't save his mother. But maybe, just maybe, he could save Margaret Harris. And in saving her, Maybe he could save some small piece of himself. The weekend passed in a strange suspension of time. Margaret slept for 12 hours straight that first night, waking Saturday morning to sunlight streaming through windows she'd forgotten to curtain. She lay in bed, an actual bed with a mattress that didn't have broken springs, staring at the ceiling and trying to remember how to be something other than exhausted. The cottage was stocked with food, as Alexander had promised. Margaret made coffee in a kitchen that was hers, ate toast at a table where no one would judge her for taking up space, and felt the unfamiliar sensation of not being needed. It was terrifying.
For 28 years, her entire existence had revolved around Michael's needs, his schedule, his preferences, his life. Now, standing in a cottage in Connecticut with nothing but time, Margaret realized she had no idea who she was without someone to take care of. She spent Saturday cleaning things that didn't need cleaning, organizing spaces that were already organized, finding any task that would fill the void where purpose used to live. By evening, she was crying again, not from sadness exactly, but from the sheer overwhelming weight of having to rebuild an identity from nothing. Sunday morning, there was a knock on her door. Alexander stood there, holding 2 coffee cups and looking uncomfortable. "I wasn't sure if you drank coffee. I brought tea as backup." "Coffee's fine," Margaret said, surprised. "Would you like to come in?" "If you're comfortable with that." They sat at her kitchen table, and for several long moments, neither spoke. Finally, Alexander said, "The first few days are the hardest." "Is it that obvious?" "You cleaned the cottage, didn't you? Everything that was already clean." Margaret's lips twitched. "How did you know?" "Because I did the same thing after my mother died. Cleaned my entire penthouse in London, twice. Then organized my files. Then rearranged my books alphabetically. Then by color. Then by publication date." He paused. "It doesn't help." "No," Margaret agreed softly. "It doesn't." "The silence is the worst part," Alexander continued, staring into his coffee. "When you're used to being needed, and then suddenly you're not. It's like losing gravity." "Yes." Margaret looked at him with new understanding. "How long did it take before you felt normal again?" Alexander's smile was sad. "I'll let you know when it happens." They sat in companionable silence, 2 broken people who understood each other's breaks because they came from the same source. Children who'd taken everything and given back nothing. "Your son will come back," Alexander said eventually. "Not soon, maybe, but he will. The guilt will eat at him until he can't ignore it anymore. And if it doesn't, then he's not the man you raised him to be, and that's his failing, not yours." Margaret felt something loosen in her chest, some knot of blame she'd been carrying since the night Michael had told her to pack her things. "You really believe that?" "I know that. Because I was Michael once. And the guilt of what I did to my mother, of missing her funeral by 17 hours, because I was in a business meeting I thought was more important. That guilt has destroyed more of me than any business failure ever could." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and Margaret saw the truth of his pain written in every line of his face. "I need you to understand something," Alexander said quietly. "This job, this house, I'm not hiring you because I feel sorry for you. I'm hiring you because I need to do something good. Because I need to believe that not every son is as blind as I was. And because—" He stopped, struggling with words. "Because being in that hotel, hearing you beg your son to see you, it was like hearing my mother's voice all over again. Your mother was lucky to have you love her, even if you didn't show it right. She died not knowing if I loved her at all." The words sat between them, brutal and honest. "I know you did," Margaret firmly said. "A child who didn't love his mother wouldn't spend 8 years drowning in guilt.
Wouldn't hire a woman he barely knows to give her the life she deserves. Wouldn't be sitting in her kitchen at 9 a.m. on a Sunday morning, making sure she's okay. Alexander's eyes glistened. He blinked rapidly, looking away. I should go. Or you could stay. Have breakfast. Tell me about the house and what you need from me. Margaret stood, moving to the stove. I'm making eggs. It's the least I can do for the man who saved my life. I didn't. You did, Margaret interrupted, cracking eggs into a pan. Now sit down and tell me what a head of household actually does, because I have no idea. Despite himself, Alexander laughed, a rusty sound, like a door that hadn't been opened in years. He sat back down and began to talk about the property, the staff, the endless details of maintaining a house that was too large for one person, but too empty to fill. And Margaret listened and cooked, and for the first time in 5 days, felt like maybe, just maybe, she was going to survive this. Monday morning arrived with purpose. Alexander met Margaret at the main house at 8, showed her to an office she hadn't seen during the initial tour, and handed her a thick folder. Staff schedules, maintenance records, property expenses, contacts for every service we use. It's a disaster. I haven't had proper household management in 3 years. I've just been throwing money at problems and hoping they resolve themselves. Margaret opened the folder and immediately understood what he meant. Invoices were out of order, maintenance records were incomplete, staff schedules conflicted with each other. May I reorganize this? She asked. Please. Do whatever you think is necessary. You have full authority to hire, fire, change schedules, whatever the house needs. That's a lot of trust for someone you've known less than a week. Alexander met her gaze steadily. I'm an excellent judge of character, Mrs. Harris. It's how I built a billion-dollar company, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that you're the kind of person who does things right even when no one's watching. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. She couldn't remember the last time someone had praised her competence, rather than just accepting her labor as a given. She spent that first week learning the property, meeting the staff, reorganizing systems that had been neglected for years. The cook, Mrs. Chen, was delighted to have someone actually coordinate meal planning. The groundskeeper, Paul, was relieved to have someone who understood the difference between urgent and important repairs. The housekeeper, Sophia, practically cried when Margaret asked her what supplies she needed instead of just expecting everything to magically appear. The last household manager quit 3 years ago. Mr. Sinclair tried to do it himself, but he's never here, and when he is here, he's... She trailed off diplomatically. Grieving? Margaret supplied gently. Sophia nodded. His mother. He doesn't talk about it, but you can see it. He's like a ghost in his own house. Margaret understood that better than most. By Friday, she had reorganized the entire household operation, created proper schedules, established a budget system, coordinated the various services so they didn't conflict. The house began to feel less chaotic, more purposeful.
That evening, Alexander found her in the office, still working at 7 p.m. Ms. Harris, it's Friday night. You're allowed to stop working. Margaret looked up startled. Oh, I didn't realize the time. That makes 2 of us. I've been in conference call since noon. He loosened his tie, looking exhausted. Have you eaten? I was going to make something at the cottage. Mrs. Chen left dinner in the kitchen. More than I can eat alone. Would you join me? It was the first time he'd asked for her company, rather than just encountering her in the normal course of the day. Margaret hesitated, suddenly aware of the boundary between employer and employee. It's dinner, not a marriage proposal, Alexander said dryly, reading her hesitation. I'm just tired of eating alone in a house built for 20 people. They ate in the kitchen, not the formal dining room, at a counter that overlooked the gardens. Mrs. Chen had left roasted chicken, vegetables, fresh bread. Simple food, but perfect. "How was your first week?" Alexander asked. "Overwhelming? Satisfying? Strange. I think good. The house already feels different, more alive. It's a beautiful property. It deserves to feel like someone lives here." "Someone does live here. I'm just not very good at it." "Why do you have a house this large if you live alone?" "I bought it from my mother," Alexander said, his voice carefully neutral. "After I made my first billion, I wanted to give her everything she'd never had. A mansion, staff, gardens, security, the life she'd sacrificed so I could have opportunities. But she never lived here? She died 3 weeks before closing." Alexander took a long drink of wine. "I bought it anyway. Kept telling myself I'd sell it, but I never did. Maybe because selling it would mean admitting she was really gone, or maybe because keeping it is the punishment I deserve for being too late." "You're punishing yourself by living in a beautiful house?" "I'm punishing myself by living in a mausoleum of intentions that never became actions." Alexander's jaw tightened. "Every room here is something I plan to share with her. Every garden is a conversation we never had. I built her a paradise and then let her die alone in a 2-bedroom flat in Manchester." Margaret set down her fork. "Alexander, can I tell you something?" "Of course." "I think your mother would be more hurt by you torturing yourself in her memory than by you missing her death by 17 hours. He looked at her startled. "You said you loved her. You showed it by building a company that could give her everything. You showed it by buying this house. You showed it by carrying her loss like an open wound for 8 years. That's not nothing. It's not enough. Love is never enough when someone dies. There's always something left unsaid, something left undone. But that doesn't make the love you showed any less real." Alexander was quiet for a long time. Then, so quietly she almost didn't hear it. "She left me a letter, in her will. Do you want to know what it said?" Margaret waited. "Darling Alex, I hope you build empires. I hope you change the world. I hope you find someone who makes you happier than money ever could. And I hope, someday, you forgive yourself for being human. All my love, always. Mum." His voice cracked on the last word. She knew I'd blame myself, and she forgave me before I even had anything to forgive. Tears streamed down Margaret's face. "She sounds like she was an extraordinary woman." "She was. Like you." Their eyes met across the counter, and something shifted in the air between them. Some recognition of shared wounds, shared losses, shared understanding that couldn't exist between people who hadn't both been broken by love. "Michael hasn't called," Margaret said suddenly. "It's been a week, not one call." "I know." "How do you know?" "Because you check your phone every 30 minutes. Because you jump every time it buzzes. Because you look like someone waiting for a plane that hasn't finished landing yet." Margaret laughed, a broken sound. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who did the same thing after his mother died, waiting for a call that would never come because the person who loved him most was gone." They finished dinner in silence, washing dishes side by side like they'd done it 1,000 times before. When Margaret moved to leave, Alexander touched her arm gently. "Thank you. For dinner. For the company. For understanding. Thank you for giving me a reason to understand instead of just survive." Margaret walked back to her cottage through gardens lit by soft ground lights, and for the first time since Michael had told her to pack her things, she didn't cry herself to sleep. Progress, she thought. Small, painful, fragile progress. The days became weeks. Margaret learned the rhythms of the house, the property, the staff. She learned that Alexander worked 18-hour days when he was trying not to think, that he ran 5 miles every morning in silence, that he took his coffee black and his grief straight. She learned that he was kind to staff, generous with time off, patient with mistakes. She learned that he was brilliant in business, but utterly lost in matters of the heart. She learned that he played piano at 2 in the morning when insomnia won, and the music he chose was always melancholy, always searching for something it never quite found. And Alexander learned about Margaret in return, learned that she hummed while she worked, that she checked her phone compulsively even though Michael never called, that she cried in the garden when she thought no one was watching, learned that she was meticulous about details, fierce about fairness, and carried guilt like other people carried breath. They developed a routine, dinner together twice a week in the kitchen, both of them pretending it was about convenience rather than loneliness. Weekend mornings where they'd drink coffee in companionable silence. Late evenings when Alexander would find Margaret in the office and quietly help her with paperwork neither of them wanted to do alone. They didn't talk about what they were building, didn't examine it too closely. Two drowning people who'd found something solid to hold on to weren't going to question whether it was a life raft or a mirage. 3 weeks after Margaret arrived, she woke to find an envelope slipped under her cottage door. Inside was a handwritten note and a credit card. Ms. Harris, the cottage needs personalizing. Please purchase whatever makes it feel like home. Furniture, art, plants, books. Budget is unlimited. You deserve a space that's yours. A.
Margaret stared at the card, then at the note, then at the cottage that was beautiful but still felt temporary. She'd been afraid to mark it as her own, afraid to believe this life was real. But Alexander was giving her permission to stay, to plant roots, to believe. She spent that Saturday in town buying things she'd never allowed herself to want. A bookshelf and books, actual books, not library rentals. Plants for the windowsills, a comfortable reading chair, art for the walls, prints of gardens and forests, not expensive but chosen because they made her smile. When she returned, Alexander's car was in the drive. She found him in the main house library, surrounded by papers. "Did you find things?" he asked, looking up. "I did, thank you. You didn't have to. I wanted to. The cottage should feel like it's yours, not borrowed." Margaret sat in the chair across from his desk, a decision crystallizing. "Alexander, can I ask you something?" "Anything." "Why are you really doing this? All of this? The job, the cottage, the kindness. What do you get from it?" Alexander set down his pen, considering. "Redemption, maybe, or at least the hope of it. I can't undo what I did to my mother, but I can make sure her story has a different ending through you. I'm not your mother. No, but you're someone's mother. And maybe if I can help that someone see what he's throwing away before it's too late, maybe it counts for something. Do you think Michael will come back? I know guilt, and I know how it grows. Right now, he's probably convincing himself he did the right thing. But eventually, the truth will start leaking through. Maybe when he needs something you always did for him. Maybe when he has a child of his own. Maybe when Rebecca shows her true nature in some new way. But it will happen. And if it doesn't, then you'll have built a life that doesn't need him in it. And that's not a bad ending either. Margaret thought about that. When did you stop waiting for your mother to call? The question hit Alexander visibly. He closed his eyes, breathed deep. About 6 months after the funeral, I kept her number in my phone, would almost call it sometimes, forget for just a second that she was gone. Then one day I realized I was calling a ghost, and ghosts don't answer. I'm still waiting for Michael to call, Margaret admitted, even though I know I shouldn't. Give it time. Grief has its own timeline. Is that what this is? Grief? You lost your son. Not to death, but to choices and cruelty and his own blindness. That deserves to be grieved. Margaret felt tears building. I don't know how to stop loving him. You don't have to stop loving him. You just have to start loving yourself enough to survive him. The words hung in the air like a challenge Margaret wasn't sure she could meet. That night, she arranged her new belongings in the cottage, making it hers for the first time. As she placed the last book on the shelf, a collection of poetry she'd wanted since college but never had money for, her phone rang. Unknown number. Her heart stopped. Michael? Could it be Michael? She answered, hands shaking. Hello? Is this Margaret Harris? A woman's voice, not Rebecca. Yes? I'm calling from Mercy Hospital. We have a Michael Harris here who listed you as emergency contact. There's been an accident. The world tilted sideways. The drive to the city took 90 minutes that felt like 90 hours. Alexander drove. He'd insisted when he'd found Margaret standing frozen in her cottage, phone still clutched in her hand, unable to process the words the hospital had said. Car accident? Serious but stable? Emergency contact? She'd still listed him. Even after everything, Margaret Harris had kept her son as her emergency contact. He'll be fine, Alexander said for the dozenth time, eyes on the dark highway. Stable means fine. Stable means not dying, Margaret corrected, her voice hollow. It doesn't mean fine. Do you want me to come in with you? No. I'll call you when I know something. But when they arrived at Mercy Hospital and Margaret actually saw the building, fluorescent lights harsh against the night sky, the smell of antiseptic and fear wafting through automatic doors, she turned to Alexander with panic in her eyes. I can't, she whispered. What if he doesn't want me there? What if Rebecca? Rebecca isn't his mother. You are. And if he has any sense left in him, he'll be grateful you came. Margaret walked through those doors alone, approached the reception desk on legs that felt like paper, and gave Michael's name in a voice that shook. The nurse checked her computer. Are you family? I'm his mother. The words felt both true and desperately fragile. The nurse gave her a room number, and Margaret rode the elevator to the 4th floor, walked down a hallway that smelled like disinfectant and sorrow, and stopped outside room 437. Through the small window, she could see Michael. His head was bandaged. His arm was in a sling. He looked pale, young, frighteningly vulnerable. Rebecca was sitting beside the bed, scrolling on her phone. She knocked softly and entered. Rebecca, head snapped up, her face cycled through surprise, anger, and calculation in rapid succession. What are you doing here? The hospital called me, Margaret said quietly, as his emergency contact. That's a mistake. I'm his wife. I'm his emergency contact. Apparently not in the system. Margaret moved toward the bed, her eyes on Michael. His eyes were closed, but she could see the flutter of his lids that meant he was awake, listening. How is he? Concussion, fractured arm, bruised ribs. He'll be fine. You can leave now. I'd like to hear that from a doctor. I'm his wife. I'm telling you, you're not needed here. The word needed hit like a slap. Margaret flinched but held her ground. I'm his mother. I'm staying until I speak to a doctor. You're his adopted mother, Rebecca hissed, standing now. You're a stranger who raised him. There's a difference. On the bed, Michael's eyes opened. He looked at Margaret, then at Rebecca, then back at Margaret, and said nothing. The silence was deafening. Michael, honey, I'm so glad you're okay. He doesn't need you here, Rebecca interjected. We've been managing perfectly fine without you. We have a life, a home, a future that doesn't include... Rebecca. Michael's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, but it stopped his wife mid-sentence. Stop. He closed his eyes again, exhaustion and pain written in every line of his face. "You're giving me a headache. You're giving me a... Michael, I've been here for 4 hours. I called out of work. I came immediately. And she..." Rebecca gestured at Margaret with disdain. "She shows up after being called, and you're defending her."
I'm not defending anyone. I'm asking for quiet because I have a concussion and you're yelling. Rebecca's face flushed with anger. Fine, I'll leave you two alone. Clearly that's what you want. She grabbed her purse and stormed toward the door, stopping only to shoot Margaret a look of pure venom. This doesn't mean anything. He's just confused from the medication. She left, heels clicking aggressively down the hallway. Margaret stood frozen beside Michael's bed, unsure what to do with this unexpected moment alone with her son. "You came," Michael said, finally, still not looking at her. "Of course I came. You're my son. Even after everything?" "Even after everything." Michael was quiet for a long moment. Then, so quietly Margaret almost didn't hear, "The accident was my fault. I was distracted. Thinking about..." He trailed off. "Thinking about what?" "You. Where you went. If you were okay. If you hated me." Margaret felt her throat close. "I could never hate you." "You should. I should do a lot of things. Hating you isn't one of them." Michael finally looked at her then, and Margaret saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen in years, the little boy he'd been, scared and broken and desperate to be loved. "Rebecca was right about me being confused. The accident? When I woke up in the ambulance, I couldn't remember her name, couldn't remember where I lived, couldn't remember anything except being 7 years old and you singing me to sleep because I was afraid of the dark." Tears rolled down Margaret's cheeks. "The paramedic asked who to call, and I said my mom. Not Rebecca, not my wife. You! I said your name like you were the only person in the world who mattered. Michael! I've been so stupid. So incredibly stupid. Rebecca, she convinced me that you were holding me back, that your sacrifices were manipulation, that I owed you nothing because you chose to adopt me. And I believed her. I believed her because it was easier than being grateful." "Stop," Margaret said softly, sitting in the chair Rebecca had vacated. "Don't do this because you had an accident. Don't do this because you're in pain and scared." "I'm not doing it because of the accident. I'm doing it because the accident made me realize something." Michael turned his head to look at her fully. "If I had died tonight, the last thing I said to you was, 'Pack your things.' The last thing I did was kick you out of my life. And I would have died, knowing I treated the woman who saved me like she was disposable. But you didn't die. You're okay." "Am I?" Michael's laugh was bitter. "I'm lying in a hospital bed, realizing my wife doesn't actually care about me beyond what I can provide. Realizing I threw away the one person who loved me unconditionally. How is that okay?" Margaret took his hand, the one that wasn't in a sling, and held it gently. "You're 28 years old. You made a mistake. It doesn't define you." "It should." "No, what defines you is what you do next." Michael closed his eyes, fresh tears leaking from the corners. "I don't know what to do next. I don't know how to fix this." "You don't have to fix anything tonight. You have to rest, heal, and when you're ready, we'll talk." "You'd do that? After everything?" "Michael, I didn't spend 28 years loving you to stop because you hurt me. That's not how love works." "It should be. It would be easier for you if you could just stop." "Easier isn't always better." A doctor entered then, interrupting the moment. She checked Michael's vitals, asked questions, confirmed he'd be discharged in the morning. Margaret listened, asked her own questions, and made mental notes of care instructions in that automatic mother way that never quite turns off. When the doctor left, Michael was drifting toward sleep, the medication and exhaustion pulling him under.
"Mom?" he mumbled. It was the first time he'd called her that in months. "I'm here. Don't leave." "I won't leave. Promise?" "Promise." Michael fell asleep holding her hand. Margaret sat in the uncomfortable hospital chair, watching her son breathe, and felt something in her chest that had been cracked start to tentatively knit itself back together. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It wasn't healing, not completely, but it was possibility. And after 4 weeks of grief, possibility felt like hope. Her phone buzzed. A text from Alexander. "How is he?" "Stable, awake, complicated. Do you need anything?" Margaret looked at her son, sleeping fitfully in a hospital bed, and then at her phone. "I need time. Take all you need. I'll be here when you're ready." Margaret pocketed the phone and settled in for a long night. Outside the window, the city glowed, with millions of lives being lived, some breaking, some healing, some somewhere and suspended between the two. Inside room 437, a mother held her son's hand and waited for morning. Morning came gray and cold. Michael woke around 6, disoriented and in pain. Margaret was still there, dozing in the chair, her hand still loosely holding his. "Mom," his voice was rough. "I'm here. How do you feel?" "Like I got hit by a car." "That's because you did." Michael tried to smile and winced. "Where's Rebecca?" "She left last night, said you were confused from medication." "She's not wrong about that." Michael shifted, trying to sit up. Margaret immediately helped him, adjusting pillows, making sure his injured arm was supported. Old habits, automatic and unconsidered. When the doctor left, an uncomfortable silence settled between mother and son. "I don't know what to say," Michael admitted. "Last night I said things, but I don't know if I said them right." "You don't have to say anything." "I do." Michael cut him off, his voice firm despite the pain. "I need to say this. All of it." Margaret waited.
I know, but I took advantage of your generosity, and this is me trying to correct that. Alexander watched this exchange with interest. Counterproposal. You keep half. Give your mother half. Use your half to build something. A future that isn't dependent on taking from people who love you. Use hers to pay her back in part for years of sacrifice. That's $24,000, Margaret protested. That's too much. It's not enough, Michael said firmly. It's not even close to enough, but it's what I have, and I want you to have it. Margaret looked at her son, really looked at him, saw the guilt, yes, but also genuine desire to make amends, to change, to be better. Half, she conceded, 24,000, and you use the other half to get your own place, build your own life. Prove to yourself that you can stand on your own feet. Deal. They shook hands, solemnly, sealing the agreement. After dinner, Michael returned to the guest house, leaving Margaret and Alexander alone in the kitchen. They washed dishes in companionable silence, a routine so familiar now it felt like it had always existed. He's really trying, really changing. He's growing up, finally. Do you think it'll last? Or is this just temporary guilt? I think he had a moment of profound clarity when he thought he might die. Those moments don't fade easily. He'll backslide, everyone does, but the core change is real. You speak from experience. I speak from wishing I'd had that moment before my mother died instead of after. Margaret set down the dish she was drawing. Alexander, can I ask you something personal? You can ask anything. Are you lonely? The question hung in the air like mist. Alexander didn't answer immediately. He finished washing the last plate, dried his hands, poured 2 glasses of wine, handed one to Margaret. Yes, he said finally, profoundly lonely. But I've been lonely for so long that most days I don't notice anymore. It's just background noise. That's the saddest thing I've ever heard. Is it? I think being lonely in a crowd is sadder. Being with people who don't see you. At least my loneliness is honest. You're not alone anymore, though.
You have staff. You have Michael here. You have me. Do you have me? Alexander asked quietly. The question shifted something in the room, made the air feel thicker, charged. What do you mean? Margaret's voice came out barely above a whisper. I mean that you work for me. That creates boundaries, power dynamics. You're here because I hired you, not because you chose me. That's not true. I stayed because I chose to. I show up to these dinners because I want to. I sit here having wine with you because I... She trailed off, not quite ready to finish the sentence. Because you what? Because you see me, Margaret said. Really see me, not as a mother, not as a worker, not as someone who exists to serve others. You see Margaret, whoever she is, when she's not being everything everyone needs. Alexander set down his wine glass. And who is Margaret when she's not being everything everyone needs? I don't know. I'm still figuring that out. Take your time. I'll be here when you figure it out. He left soon after, leaving Margaret alone in her cottage with half a glass of wine and a heart that was beating uncomfortably fast. She was developing feelings for Alexander Sinclair. The realization hit her like cold water. She was 52 years old, had spent 28 years focused exclusively on her son, had no idea how to navigate romance, and she was falling for the grieving billionaire who'd saved her life. Margaret laughed, a slightly hysterical sound. Because of course she was. Of course she'd fall for someone emotionally unavailable who saw her as penance for sins committed against his own mother. Of course, the first time she felt something for someone in decades, it would be completely impossible. She finished her wine and went to bed. But she dreamed of blue eyes and British accents, and hands that touched so carefully, like she was something precious instead of something broken. Christmas approached faster than Margaret expected. The estate transformed under her management. Decorations tasteful but warm, lights that glowed rather than glare, a tree in the main house that actually felt like celebration instead of obligation. I haven't had a real Christmas in 10 years, Alexander admitted, standing in the living room and staring at the tree. Since my mother died. Then it's time you did, Margaret said firmly. Michael offered to help with decorations. His arm was mostly healed now, and he was looking for ways to contribute. The three of them spent an afternoon hanging ornaments, stringing lights, making the house feel less like a museum and more like a home. Can I ask you something? Michael said to Alexander as they worked. Why did you help my mom? Really? Alexander paused, ornament in hand. Your mother spilled coffee on my jacket in a hotel. I was annoyed. Then I looked at her hands, really looked at them, and saw 28 years of hard labor written in calluses and scars. And I saw my mother's hands. She'd worked herself to death giving me opportunities, and I'd never noticed her hands until they were folded in a casket. So you helped my mom because of guilt, Michael said. I helped your mother because I recognized her, because I knew what it looked like when someone gave everything and received nothing, and because I thought maybe, just maybe if I could save her, it would count for something. Does it count for something? I don't know. But your mother is here, alive, building a life that values her, and that's better than the alternative. Margaret absorbed this. I'm grateful that you saw her when I was too blind to see. Don't be grateful to me. Be better than I was. I learned too late. You get the chance to learn before it's too late. That's a gift I never had. The moment sat heavy between them.
On Christmas Eve, Margaret cooked dinner, a real dinner, with all the traditional fixings. Mrs. Chan had offered to handle it, but Margaret had insisted. This was something she wanted to do. Michael set the table, Alexander opened wine, and for the first time in years, any of them ate a meal that felt like family. Can we make a toast? Michael asked, raising his glass. Of course, Margaret said. To second chances. To my mom, who loved me even when I didn't deserve it. To Alexander, who gave her a place to heal. And to whatever comes next, because it has to be better than what came before. They clinked glasses, and Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. Good tears, for once. Healing tears. After dinner, Alexander disappeared and returned with 2 wrapped boxes. He handed one to Michael, one to Margaret. "I don't do gifts well," he said, uncomfortably, "but you both deserved something." Michael opened his first, a leather journal, expensive and beautiful, for writing down who you want to be and holding yourself accountable to it. Michael's eyes glistened. "Thank you." Margaret opened hers slowly. Inside was a small framed photo, black and white, slightly faded. 2 women, arms around each other, laughing. One she recognized immediately. "Is this—" She couldn't finish. "My mother and her best friend," Alexander confirmed. "Taken when she was about your age, when she was happy, before life got hard. I wanted you to have it because you remind me of her in that photo. Resilient, beautiful, worth more than the world gave her." Margaret couldn't speak. She just held the photo and cried. Michael reached into his pocket. "I have something too. It's not much, but—" He pulled out an envelope and handed it to Margaret. Inside was a check for $24,000, the agreed-upon amount, and a handwritten letter. "Read it later," Michael said quickly, "when you're alone." The evening wound down slowly. Michael returned to the guest house, Alexander retreated to his study, and Margaret sat in her cottage holding the photo and the envelope, feeling like her life had somehow become unrecognizable from what it had been 6 weeks ago. She opened Michael's letter. "Mom, I don't know how to apologize for what I did, for believing someone who told me your love was manipulation, for throwing you away when you'd given me everything, for being so blind that it took a car accident to make me see what I'd lost. But I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying. Not because I owe you, not because guilt demands it, but because you deserve a son who recognizes how lucky he is, who sees your sacrifices as love, not obligation, who understands that being adopted doesn't make you less my mother, it makes you more my mother because you chose me when you didn't have to. I love you. I've always loved you. I just forgot how to show it. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for showing me what real love looks like. Thank you for being my mom. Forever grateful, Michael." Margaret folded the letter carefully and held it to her chest. Outside, snow had started to fall, the first snow of the season, covering the grounds in soft, white silence. She looked at Alexander's photo, at Michael's letter, at the cottage that had become her sanctuary, and realized that for the first time in 28 years, she wasn't just surviving. She was living. January brought bitter cold and unexpected news. Michael's divorce was finalized with surprising speed. Rebecca had signed every paper without contest, eager to sever ties completely. The house was hers, the debt was hers, the future she had built on fraud was entirely hers. Michael seemed relieved rather than sad. "I keep thinking I should grieve the marriage," he told Margaret one afternoon as they worked on estate accounting together. "But I don't think I ever had a marriage to grieve. I had an arrangement, a performance, not an actual partnership." "How do you tell the difference?" "Partnership is this." He gestured between them. "Working together, respecting each other, building something without keeping score. Rebecca kept score of everything. Every favor was debt. Every kindness was leverage." "That sounds exhausting." "It was. I just didn't realize it until I wasn't living it anymore." Michael's month of recovery had stretched into 2, then 3. He paid rent religiously, helped with household management, started looking for new job opportunities in Connecticut. He wasn't living off Margaret. He was living near her. There was a difference.
"Are you going to move out?" Margaret asked one evening. "Eventually? Do you want me to?" "I want you to do what's right for you. Building your own life, your own independence. What if my own life includes being near you, not dependent on you, but choosing to be close? Is that allowed?" Margaret felt her heart swell. "That's very allowed." Alexander watched these developments with quiet approval. He saw Michael changing, really changing, not just performing change. Saw him take responsibility, make decisions, build himself into someone solid. "He's going to be okay," Alexander told Margaret one night as they shared their now traditional evening wine. "I think you're right. You did that. You saved him by letting him fall. That's harder than catching him would have been. You helped, giving him space but structure, expectations but grace. We made a good team," Alexander said, and something in his tone made Margaret look up. He was watching her with an expression she'd seen growing more frequent, soft, unguarded, almost vulnerable. "Alexander, I need to tell you something, and I need you just to listen until I finish." Margaret nodded, her heart racing. "When I brought you here, it was penance, a way to ease guilt I've carried for 8 years, a chance to save someone since I couldn't save my mother. That's how it started." He paused, choosing words carefully. "But it's not how it continued. Somewhere between November and now, between coffee and conversations, and watching you rebuild yourself into someone extraordinary, it stopped being about my guilt and started being about you. About us. Alexander."
New life. Time for new habits. The cottage became a true guest house. Michael stayed there when he visited. It was perfect, close enough to feel like family, far enough to maintain boundaries. One evening in July, as Margaret and Alexander sat in the garden watching sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose, Alexander pulled out a small box. "Before you panic," he said, "this isn't a proposal. Not yet, but it's a promise." Inside was a delicate necklace, a single diamond pendant, simple and elegant. "It was my mother's," Alexander said softly. "The only piece of jewelry she kept when times were hard. She left it to me with instructions to give it to someone who understood what sacrifice looked like. Someone who gave without counting cost. Someone like her." "Alexander, I can't." "You can, and you will, because you're exactly who she meant. You're who I meant, though I didn't know it when she died." He fastened the necklace around Margaret's throat, his fingers gentle against her skin. "I love you," he said, "not because you remind me of my mother, not because you're fixing my guilt, but because you're Margaret, stubborn, strong, gentle, fierce Margaret, who makes every day feel less empty." "I love you too," Margaret whispered. "And I'm scared of that. Scared of being happy because what if it gets taken away?" "Then we'll face that together. But Margaret, you can't refuse happiness because you're afraid of loss. That's not living. That's just surviving with better scenery." She kissed him then, tasting salt from tears neither of them was ashamed of. August brought Michael's 29th birthday. Margaret hosted a small party at the estate. Just Michael, Alexander, and the core staff who'd become family. Mrs. Chen made Michael's childhood favorite cake. Paul arranged flowers from the garden. Sophia decorated with streamers that were slightly ridiculous but perfect. "Speech," Alexander called as they gathered around the table. Michael stood, looking uncomfortable but determined. "I'm not good at speeches, but I want to say something." Everyone quieted. "A year ago, I was married to the wrong person for the wrong reasons. I was living off my mother while treating her like an inconvenience. I was convinced that independence meant cutting out anyone who cared about me. I was basically an idiot." Laughter rippled through the small group. "Then I had a car accident and woke up realizing I'd almost died having treated the most important person in my life like garbage.
and I thought my life was over. Thought I'd destroyed everything that mattered." He looked at Margaret. "But Mom did what she always does. She loved me anyway. Not because I deserved it, but because that's who she is. And Alexander gave me space to figure out who I wanted to be instead of who I'd become." Michael's voice cracked. "I'm 29 today, and for the first time in my life, I actually like who I am. I'm not perfect. I'm still figuring things out, but I'm trying, really trying, and that's because of the two of you." He raised his glass. "To second chances, to people who love you even when you're unlovable, and to becoming someone worth that love." They drank to that, and Margaret felt like her heart might burst from the fullness of it all. Later, after the party wound down and Michael had driven home, Margaret and Alexander sat on the porch swing watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. "He's going to be okay," Alexander said. "Really okay." "I know, I can finally believe that." "And you, are you okay?" Margaret thought about that. Thought about where she had been a year ago, sleeping on a broken sofa, paying bills for a son who didn't appreciate her, believing that sacrifice was the same as love. Thought about where she was now, in a home that valued her, with a partner who saw her, watching her son build a life worth living. "I'm more than okay," she said. "I'm happy. Actually, genuinely happy." "You say that like it's surprising." "It is. I spent so long believing happiness was something other people got, something I could provide for others but never experience myself. And now? Now I think maybe I was wrong. Maybe happiness was always available. I just had to believe I deserved it." "You deserve everything good, Margaret Harris. Every single thing." They sat there until stars filled the entire sky, two people who'd been broken by love, learning how to be healed by it instead. October arrived with brilliant foliage and unexpected news. Alexander received a call from his company's board. They wanted him to consider a merger that would require relocating to London for at least a year. "I told him no," he told Margaret. "Why?" "Because my life is here. You're here. Alexander, if this is important for your business—" "My business has been my life for 20 years. It's time something else was more important." "Don't make that decision because of me. Don't give up opportunities because—" "I'm not giving up anything," Alexander interrupted. "I'm choosing. There's a difference." But Margaret saw the conflict in his eyes. This mattered, even if he was denying it. She called Michael that night, explained the situation. "What do you think I should do?" she asked. "Go with him," Michael said immediately. "What?" "Mom, you spent 28 years making sacrifices. This isn't sacrifice, it's adventure. It's a chance to see the world with someone who loves you. Why wouldn't you go?" "Because I've built a life here. I have the estate, the staff, responsibilities." "You have a job managing a household. That's not a life, that's an occupation. Your life is with Alexander, and if his life needs to be in London for a year, your life should be there too." "When did you become so wise?" "When I finally started listening to the woman who raised me." Margaret talked to Alexander that weekend. "If you need to go to London, we go to London." "Margaret, I'm not uprooting your life." "You're not uprooting anything. You're giving me a chance to see parts of the world I've only dreamed about. To build the life that's mine, not just service to others. To choose adventure over safety." "Are you sure?" "I'm terrified, but I'm sure."
They moved to London in December, settling into a beautiful flat in Kensington. The first few months were adjustment. Margaret learning a new city, a new rhythm, a new version of herself that wasn't defined by being someone's mother or employee. Alexander introduced her to his world. Business dinners where she held her own, charity galas where her grace surprised everyone, quiet evenings where they explored the city like teenagers instead of people in their 50s. Michael visited for Christmas. They spent the holiday in London, and Margaret showed her son the city with the enthusiasm of someone discovering it for the first time, because she was. "You're different here," Michael observed as they walked through Hyde Park. "How so?" "Lighter.
like you're finally living for yourself instead of through other people. Is that bad? It's the best thing I've ever seen. On New Year's Eve, Alexander took Margaret to the London Eye at midnight. As fireworks exploded over the Thames, painting the sky in colors that defied description, he pulled out a small box. "Now it's a proposal," he said. Margaret's breath caught. "I spent 8 years dead inside, convinced I'd destroyed my chance at the kind of love my mother always wanted me to find. Then I met you, cleaning a hotel room, apologizing for existing, carrying more weight than any person should have to carry. And you changed everything." He opened the box, revealing a ring that was elegant in its simplicity. "Margaret Harris, will you marry me? Not because I'm trying to save you, but because you saved me. Not because of guilt or convenience, but because every day with you feels like a life I actually want to live." "Yes," Margaret whispered. "Yes, absolutely yes." He slipped the ring on her finger, kissed her while fireworks exploded above them, and Margaret Harris, who'd spent 52 years believing her value was only in what she gave others, finally, fully understood that she was worth loving just for being herself. They married in spring, a small ceremony in the garden of the Connecticut estate. Michael walked his mother down the aisle. Mrs. Chen cried. Paul made sure every flower was perfect. Sophia declared it the most beautiful wedding she'd ever seen. "You look happy," Michael whispered as he handed Margaret to Alexander. "I am happy," she whispered back. "Finally." The vows were simple, honest, real. No grand promises, just truth. "I promise to see you, to value you, to never take for granted the gift of your love. I promise to let you see me, to value myself enough to be loved, to never forget that I deserve the happiness I give others." They exchanged rings, and when the officiant said, "You may kiss," Alexander did, gently, reverently, like Margaret was the most precious thing he'd ever touched. Because, to him, she was. The reception lasted into evening, filled with laughter and dancing and joy that felt almost too big to contain. As the sun set, casting golden light across the gardens, Margaret stood with Alexander and Michael, looking at the life she'd somehow built from the wreckage of being thrown away. "Thank you," she said to both of them. "For what?" Michael asked. "For teaching me different lessons about love. Michael, you taught me that love can break you and still be worth saving, that people can change, that forgiveness isn't weakness, it's courage." She turned to Alexander. "And you taught me that I'm worth loving even when I'm not being useful, that my value isn't in my sacrifice, but in my existence, that happiness isn't selfish, it's necessary." "We taught each other," Alexander said softly. "You taught me that it's never too late to honor someone, that guilt can become grace, that love is always worth the risk. And you taught me," added Michael, "that being a good son isn't about being perfect. It's about being honest, taking responsibility, and choosing every day to be worthy of the people who never gave up on you." They stood there, 3 people who'd been broken in different ways, who'd found each other in the wreckage, who'd built something beautiful from the pieces. "What happens now?" Margaret asked. "Now?" Alexander pulled her closer. "Now we live, really live. Together." "Together," Margaret echoed. And as stars emerged in the twilight sky above the Connecticut estate, Margaret Harris Sinclair, who'd been thrown away like something worthless, finally understood what it meant to be cherished. The end. Margaret lived the next 20 years as Margaret Sinclair. She traveled the world with Alexander, managed properties that became homes instead of investments, reconciled fully with Michael, who grew into a man worth being proud of. She never forgot the night Michael had told her to pack her things, never forgot the feeling of being disposable. But she also never let that night define her. Because love, real love, the kind worth having, doesn't come from being perfect. It comes from being seen, being valued, being chosen, every single day. And Margaret Harris Sinclair was finally, beautifully chosen. Not because she was useful, but because she was extraordinary. She always had been.